Thank you all for being here and engaging with us today. As I just mentioned, the general topic that I'm going to talk about today is poverty and race, but we're going to take that in lots of different ways. But I want to just start with kind of stepping back and being like, okay, I assume everyone in this room knows there's some level of racial inequality, but let's just take a scale and figure out kind of where's racial inequality today. How is it leveling up, particularly in the United States? I was thinking about this when Dan was talking earlier. I'm actually teaching right now a class called Race Around the World and Back Again, which is my favorite part of the title, even though it's not technically in the course. The registrar's office cut that part out. But anyways, it's a global race. So I love talking about global race. But this talk today is going to be fairly centric on the US. So sorry for those of you who are not here. I'm happy in the question and answer time to expand the conversation. But we will start where we are sitting, which is the US. So generally speaking, sociologists, of which I am one, talk about racial inequality in various categories, including health, finances, work, and education. And so just to get a glimpse, we'll start with each of these. So this data I'm going to show you on health comes from the death certificate data. So it's every single person who's died in the United States. So it's a comprehensive examination. It's the most recent data available to researchers, which is from 2016. What am I saying? So what I want you to notice here is we have racial groups, and we have them also broken down by gender. Gender, I always have trouble saying that word. And this is the average age of death. So probably not too surprising, but white women in the US live to be the longest, followed by Asian women and then white men. What you'll notice is that Native American men have the shortest lifespan in our country. This is the proportion of people who die of cardiovascular disease or heart disease. So that's the most common cause of death in the US. I know, we're starting on a really good tone. I realize that as I'm saying this. Let's just talk about death for a minute. But it's okay. We know Jesus died for us, right? We can talk about death and think about all its implications. Anyway, so what you see here is the proportion of people who die because of heart disease. You'll see some of the inequality is a little bit less, particularly across the genders, but what you'll notice is that blacks and Asians actually suffer, are most likely to die of heart disease. Here is maternal mortality. This has gotten a lot of news recently because researchers are increasingly looking at how desperate these inequalities are. And as soon as I put it up, I heard something in the crowd because this is striking, right? And this is 2016 data. It's every single person who died in the United States, so there's no sampling, there's no bias here. Blacks are dying at a much higher rate from maternal mortality. Maternal mortality counts anything that happened that caused death related around pregnancy. So that can be during pregnancy, during a birth, or immediately thereafter attributed to the pregnancy. So those kind of gives you a general picture that we see racial inequality, and these are just a snapshot, but in a few very central ways that we look at it as far as health goes. Moving on to finances, we're going to start with poverty. So there's lots of ways to measure poverty. There's also lots of ways to measure finance, which that's why I'm going to show you three. But I'm using the federal poverty line here. The federal poverty line is the most common used because it's what determines programs in our country, such as needs-based programs like TANF, or what used to be called welfare, or what used to be called food stamps, that's now called SNAP. If you're not familiar, if you're a family of four currently living under the poverty line as a family of four, means you're making about $24,000 a year. If you're a family of one, it means you're making $12,500. So many people would say that this is a very low bar. If you think about your own finances, and living in a family of four with under $24,000 a year is a very low bar. So what I want you to notice here is, once again, we see that Native Americans and blacks, and followed by Latinx, are much more likely to live in poverty, and also women are much more likely to live in poverty than their male counterparts. So race is a bigger influencer, but gender is important across each group. This is children living in poverty, so I'm going to go back and forth for a second. So it's the same scale on purpose. So you notice that much more of our children live in poverty than our adults, and the racial inequality is actually greater, although the gender inequality is less, which makes sense because we're raising these children in the same households. We wouldn't expect as much gender inequality, but the racial inequality is larger. Part of this inequality, so poverty takes into consideration the number of people living in your house, it takes in consideration your income, but also takes in any money you're bringing in. So child support, all of that goes into that measure, that counts as your income. When we just look at earned like annual income, it's just how much you made, which means it doesn't include stocks, so we don't have the top end as much, and it also doesn't include people who are getting aid from other sources. But what you'll see here is similar inequality patterns, both across gender and race. The gender patterns are even more stark here. Women are making considerably less than men in our country, particularly our women of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Asian, Native American women. Often when we talk about these inequalities, we do that like cents to dollar conversation that's been happening a lot, like how many cents does this person make to so-and-so's dollar. So to put it in those frames, I'm just doing women here, and I'm comparing them all to white men. Now, there's lots more complexity there, but just so you get a sense. So white women, when you take everyone into consideration, we're not controlling for jobs or anything, but just across the board, make 68 cents to the white man's dollar, or a white man's dollar. Black women make 60 cents, Latinx women makes 47 cents, Asian women make 76 cents, and Native American women make 50 cents. So often when you hear these numbers, there are mean numbers when we're talking about gender inequality that don't actually capture the extent of what's going on when it comes to race. Now, income is a really important piece of this, but if you are at all familiar with this conversation, sociologists would argue that wealth is much more important when it comes to our well-being than income. So what is wealth? When we think about wealth, we think about just like people have money. That's not exactly what I mean. I'm using more of a technical definition. And that technical definition is all your assets minus all your debts. So all your assets is if you own a house, if you own a boat, if you're like that, if you own a car, if you have stocks, anything in your bank account. So it's not your annual income, it's like what you have right now minus all your debt. Credit card debt, mortgage debt, car loan, anything like that. So that's what we conceptualize as wealth, which means it can go negative, it could be zero, it could be positive. So these are the mean wealth measures in the most recent year for our nation. And again, I broke them by gender because that's also an important piece here. What you'll see is, on average, this is median. We don't have a ton of wealth hanging around. So, you might think like, I'm not wealthy. Well, the country isn't quote unquote that wealthy either. White men on average, or the median, if you want to be really specific, have about $34,000 in wealth. But that's so much larger than the $400 that Black women have. So what I want you to notice there is that stark inequality both across race and gender. So moving on to work, so part of this is who can get jobs and who's working when. So this is just general employment rates. Almost everyone, but not everyone, men work more than women. The exception there is Black women have a higher proportion of Black women are working than Black men, which has a lot to do, as I'm sure many of you know, with incarceration and criminalization, as well as stigmatization in the workplace. But what I want you to notice is there is still some of this inequality across races, but it's not nearly as uniformed or like a clear story than anything else I was just showing you, right? It's much more across the board if you are actually visualizing that those bar graphs. And what's important about that is that income gap is not coming from the work gap. People are working, they're just not getting paid the same amount of money. The other piece of this is people who are actively looking for work. So these are people who have put out multiple applications in the last year. And what you'll see is last month, last 30 days is actually the technical definition. Black women are the most likely to have been actively looking for work. So they're not only the most likely to be employed, they're also the most likely trying to get employed across the board. Sorry, I said that wrong. Black men, thank you. I just was like, wait, that doesn't right. Black men are the most. So they are less likely, missed that up, but they're less likely to work than Black women, but they're more likely to be actively seeking a job and not getting that job, followed by Native American men. The least unemployed or actively looking for work are white women. So finally, I want to talk about education. So just as a general look, I'm going to first just start with bachelor's degrees. There's a million ways to measure education, but just to be basic here, we see that there are some gender inequalities, but again, there's more racial inequalities than gender. So for the white population, it's almost exactly the same currently in our population of men and women who have bachelor's degrees. Part of this is an age cohort effect. So we have the older generation is still more likely for men to have bachelors, while the younger generation is becoming more likely for women to have bachelors. But right now it's even, which is really fascinating. Well, as someone who cares about these kind of things, I find it fascinating. But anyways, but the Asian population, men are more likely to have bachelors, but for the other three groups, women are more likely. But again, the bigger point here is Native Americans, followed by Latinx and blacks, are much less likely to have bachelor's degrees than their Asian and white neighbors. Finally, part of this comes from what they're getting actually prepared to do. So this data comes from the public school data. So this is federal data from the Department of Education. So it's every single student who's enrolled in a charter or public school. And this is the proportion of them, proportion of 11th and 12th graders who took the ACT and SAT. And what you'll see is the pattern that we see in bachelor's is starting back in high school. In other words, white and Asian students are more likely, and women in particular, like I was just referencing with the new generation, are more likely to take these tests. Likewise, and even more stark, is who's getting retained. So retention in public school talk is held back or not passed into the next grade. I know that when you're talking in higher education, retention is a good thing because you kept them in school, but retention when you're talking K to 12 means they didn't pass the next grade. And what you'll see is black boys are the most likely to be held back across all of our public school students. Finally, the last one I want to show you, oops, nope, I didn't put it in there. I don't know why. I was going to show you suspensions, and the story is very similar, but even more dramatic. So as a whole, we can see if we're looking at health, or we're looking at finances, or we're looking at work, or finally education, there are some stark and undeniable racial inequalities in our country. And so my question that I want us to wrestle with for a few minutes is why? By a few minutes, I mean 45, but you know. Relative time here. But I'm going to ask you to help me answer what you think that question is in a second. But before I want to do that, I want to clarify the what. What are racial categories? So just to get us all on the same page, I'm putting even more. If you thought I just had my professor hat on, hold on, I'm going to really put on my professor hat and get really nerdy for a second. So the word race was adopted into the English language from Spanish during the 1500s or the 16th century, depending on which kind of language you want to use. And that word in Spanish at the time was used to talk about animal breeding, and its purpose was to distinguish hierarchies of categories to denote that certain animals shouldn't breed with other animals. So it was often used for horses to talk about how thoroughbreds shouldn't be breeding with, and now I'm totally out of my league, thank you, mother, draft horses. Who actually knows anything about horses? I was about to say it, and then I was like, I normally do this in class where I'm pretty confident no one's going to call me out, and then I'm like, my mother's sitting here who actually knows something about horses. Anyways, so that's how the word was used. And so when it was brought into English, it never was neutral. The concept of race has never been neutral, and it also, in the way that we use it, did not exist before the 1500s. So it grew in a time of colonialization, of expansion, and it always has entailed this idea of, one, you can't breed between each other, and two, there's a hierarchy of who is better than the other. The third piece of it that we've always held to since the 1500s is that there's a set number of categories, and that those categories are some kind of unchangeable number. Now, ironically, we constantly change that number, but we always believe that it's a set number. So, think about that for a minute. But that's the other piece of this word. But when we do think about that for a minute, and when you start to deconstruct how, in many ways, ridiculous the whole thing is, you just have to start thinking about the map. So this is the map of the world, or the land masses of the world, or trying to be the land masses of the world. And first of all, I'm not going to call them out, but I love that I have two high schoolers in here, because I love wrestling with high schoolers on this too, because what the heck is the difference between Europe and Asia? Especially when you put a map like this. How can we start having definitions of continents as these like separate entities, when it's like, wait, hold on, Europe and Asia, there's no divide there. And then if we want to talk about it, there's no divide between Africa. There's definitely no divide between North and South America. What the heck are we talking about with these continents? So first of all, let's just think about that. Second of all, when we talk about our current conception of whiteness, it includes both what we consider Europe and what we consider most of Russia, which doesn't even follow the continents that we just insinuated we were following. Moreover, when we think about our current conception of Asian in the US, we often think of China, Korea, Japan, and some other surrounding areas. We still wrestle with what do we do with quote-unquote India and Southern Asians. I said that wrong. We don't always really or have any know what to do with the Philippines, right? So we wrestle with this fact that we use continental language that are social construction to then put together groups that we don't think are similar, and the reason we don't think they're similar is because our actual ideas about race go back to the power and the economic relationships that we have with countries and previous to countries' empires. So they have to do with who is in relationship with who. Not to mention when we get to Africa. When we talk about Africa and we use the general term of black, we generally mean sub-Saharan Africa. And that's definitely not the whole continent. And so we've even created, in most recent years, a new word that's like really, really new in the grand scheme of things. It depends on who you talk to, but 20 to 30 years-ish of a Middle Eastern category. Why is that word created? You can directly link the usage of that word and that concept with that word with our wars and our ideas of othering and our political engagement with this space. Of course, this is nothing to say of what we are now currently and have been for about the last 50 years wrestling with what is Hispanic and or Latinx categories. So of course, Mexico and South America were also colonialized and slave communities who had the same ideas, although slightly different than the English idea, very similar ideas in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies of race. And so if you talk to people in South America and in Mexico, they also have understandings of racial hierarchy. They have understandings of who is white and there's different words, but often in Spanish who's negro, or there's different ideas of, depending on which country you're talking about, the indigenous population versus quote-unquote mixed kind of populations. Yet when they've recently come to the United States, there has been a push for political connection between those groups because of our relationship, again, with those entities, and thus we've kind of started to try to create a new racial group, and we've messed with the word ethnicity because we know that there's pushback because they have their own racial categories. So all this to say is it's super complicated, and that's why I have a job, because there's plenty to study. But what the point of why it's so complicated, why it's so important to recognize, is we say, I know you all have heard, like, these are social constructions. But we often say that and then dismiss it. And we don't think about to what extent not only are they our social constructions, but we're continuing to construct them. So often when I teach, actually this just happened, so I'm teaching that class I mentioned to the undergrads, Race Around the World, but I'm also teaching a graduate class this semester, Race and Ethnicity, and I teach them both on Mondays. It's a very interesting life experience to teach a 3-hour seminar to graduate students, have an hour break, and then do a 3-hour seminar to undergrad students, basically on the same subject. But it's fun because we have different questions going on. And so I kind of set my grad students up, and I made them play with race for the first week. And of course, by the end of class, they were all like, well, we should use the word ethnicity. Like, let's go with that word because it doesn't have this baggage, it doesn't have this history. And I was like, inside, I was like, yes, I love that you all said that because next week, just you wait. And that was this week, and what I got to share with them was the word ethnicity actually didn't come into use in the way that we use it in the English language till about the 1920s. So it's much more recent than the word race. And the word ethnicity was brought into the English language between the world wars for a very strategic purpose. Between the world wars, US was trying to look morally superior to Nazi Germany. We were trying to make the argument that we were not segregating and segmenting our population based on their background. So Germany was starting to do this with the Jews, and the US was getting pushback when they were saying that they were different Because what were they doing during Jim Crow, not only in the South, but sundown towns in the North? This was the height of lynching. They had no moral ground to stand on. So what you see scholars doing, and many scholars within my own lovely field of sociology doing, is they start to differentiate ethnicity from race. They create the word ethnicity to denote how white populations can have different cultures, and white populations in which they include the Jewish population, and in doing so humanize them and say these groups can have these different identities and we can celebrate that. But implicitly then further dehumanize the black population and our native populations by not even conceptualizing them as a group who could be ethnic. If you think about it, we rarely talk about ethnicity when it comes to the black population. Now, there's differencing there when we've had more recent waves of immigration from Africa, but when we're talking about the black population who are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, rarely do we use the word ethnicity, and that's not an accident. It's because the word ethnicity itself is a racialized construct that has furthered the idea of the white population being morally superior by accepting differences within themselves while still subjugating the black and Native American population. And so the sad news is I have no perfect word for you, and there's differences and we have to wrestle with those differences. But the good news is the beauty about understanding this baggage is recognizing that's also the baggage we face in our country. And so if we don't think about that there's no word that gets us away from the baggage, it makes us recognize we're not getting away from this baggage either, because the very essence of this baggage is what we are living in. So given that preface, why is there all this racial inequality that I showed you? First thing I want to kind of separate for a second, and particularly, I didn't think about this till I was listening to you all, and I was like, we got like a pastor crowd, cool, all right, adjusting slightly. So I want to circle things that we think about as more internal motivators. And we'll come back to the internalness and the intent in a second. Insecurity, yes, blame shifting, sure, yeah, we can count that, thank you. Other ones, am I not seeing any? Yeah, I guess, yeah, because, yeah, we can conceptualize it that way, yeah, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so I would argue that most of those are ultimately about an intent. And that makes a lot of sense. And the reason that that makes sense, that those are often our go-to, is, and I'm taking a sidetrack from my plan, just FYI, but I'm just excited to get to teach, so here we go. So it makes sense because the word racism, which I didn't define a minute ago, but is another word I love defining, fundamentally changed its meaning in English after 1954. So before, the only uses of that word in it were scholarly uses that talked about structural mechanisms that perpetuated the existing hierarchy. Racist as an individual thing, racism as did not exist, was not an individual word, never used like that. 1954, Allpart publishes a book, The Nature of Prejudice. And in that book, he makes a psychological argument that individuals who are showing, at the time he's using the word prejudice, that are showing prejudice are showing a psychological abnormality. They're going against the system and pushing back by thinking this kind of unsavory wrong thing. That word and how he's using it gets picked up, popularized, and then people start attributing that word also to racist and racism. And so after that point, we start seeing that word start being used as individuals. Now remember, that's really important time in history, where 1954, what else happened in 1954? Brown versus Board of Education. In many ways, the start of the Civil Rights Movement. So the discussion about the word racism being structural to individual happens during the Civil Rights Movement, where we no longer are thinking about the systems that are perpetuating that, but the individuals. And then it's easier, not only is it the individual's issue, but it's their heart, it's their intent. Oh, poor person who messed up. which means that that's something that we're not actually dealing with the outcome. We're not dealing with what they're doing. We're only concerned about how they're thinking or feeling. Now, I recognize that, like, I have a Christian crowd here, right? And that is, and in our kind of evangelical soup in which we do or do not fully swim, but we are amongst of, the individual nature of sin is something that we gravitate to. So calling out racism as a church, as a sin issue, is something that's really appealing. But it's also deeply problematic because it doesn't actually think about that the structure is not something, oh, you messed up, you had a psychological abnormality and you think this person is different or worse than you. No, actually, particularly as a white person, doing and thinking and perpetuating racism is in your favor. You will get more money, you will get more jobs, you will have better houses, you will have better health. It's not abnormal, it's not weird. It's perpetuating a system that's helping you. And so if we don't think about that what you're doing is actually perpetuating a system that's helping you, scrap the sin language, we're not dealing with the larger justice issues that I would argue are at the heart of not only the Old but the New Testament. My sidetrack aside, back to the mechanisms we put on the board. I want to push us a little bit. So some of these are still really broad, like economics and capitalism, which are super fun and great, but and institutional racism, and no, not that one. No, that's not as broad, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I do something similar. This is just like true confessions right now. I do something similar with my students, and I get a very different list. And so although it's always a different list, I'm like on the moment being like, I'm going to spin this differently. Okay, cool. So y'all just like bear with me for a second. So let me, okay. Of the ones that are more specific, so stereotyping, colorblindness, unjust systems, opportunity networks, voter suppression, colorism, generational addiction, policing, prisons, I want you to think about those. And I want you to think about progress over time. And particularly, I want us to start in 1980. And I have several reasons to start in 1980. Part of it is because of shifts in policy law. The other more practical reason is I think almost everyone, although not everyone in this room, was alive in 1980. Again, confession, I wasn't quite alive in 1980, but I was alive in the 80s. So it's a lifespan that you all are familiar with. So from 1980 to the present day, September 12th, 2019. Have these issues gotten worse or better? Great. Tell me more. Is it different ones have gotten worse and different ones are getting better, or everyone is getting worse and better? And if so, how is that? A little bit. Is our GDP bigger now or in the 50s? It's much bigger now. Is Amazon making more money than companies in the 50s? Right? So I hear you. And that's also the narrative we share, right? We share a narrative of scarcity. But actually, we're making a lot more money now than we were in the 50s. What's different is our policies and our regulations around who can have that money and who can keep the money. It's not that we have any more scarcity. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So let's ground ourselves slightly. So thank you for saying, that's actually, I didn't mean to like ground you. That's actually really important to think about because that is the justification for the scapegoating. But if you step back and think about the facts, it's like, wait, hold up. That don't make no sense. So let's ground ourselves in those categories I started with: health, finance, work, education. Health. On average, I'm talking inequality right now, not just overall. So inequality, let's first, for the sake of this particular conversation right now, just narrow ourselves between whites and blacks. We'll leave gender out of the equation. Do you all think that health inequality has gotten worse or better from 1980 to the present day? Okay. Do you all think that, where's my next one? Finances, so income, wealth, has gotten worse or better? Do you think employment has gotten worse or better? And do you think education has gotten worse or better? Okay, so we're not so sure on that, but the other ones we're really confident have gotten worse. Okay, so yes, it's this question of progress. So another true confession. So I was making these slides this morning at like 5 a.m. and I realized that I needed the restricted data from 1980 for the health death certificates, and I left them in Pittsburgh. So I don't have the health data to show you right now, but I know because I played with it that the pattern holds. It's very similar to the finance, which I am going to show you. So I'm going to just focus on income. And I kind of simplified it a little bit, partly because of how our government has tracked these things over these years. But I really want you to pay attention to, just for the sake of an argument really quick, the inequality we see between whites and blacks in 1980 compared to the inequality we see in 2017, which is the most recent data for this. It's 3 times larger now. So you all were right? 3 times larger. I'm sorry, that was male, and this is women. What's crazy when you look at the women is it goes from this to this. It's over 10 times larger for the women. Y'all, that's bad. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? White women are entering the workforce here, and that's part of, and not just part-time, right? So you had part-time workers in 1980 and white women that are changing that. You do see progress for white women when it comes to white women and white men. There's been progress there, but at the same time, there's a negative, the inverse direction for black women, and so we're having a growing gulf of inequality between the two of those. Employment is a little different and interesting. So the Asian employment story is different in that partly has to do with what was going on in 1980 in the Immigration Reform Act in 1965 as well as refugees. So that line feels a little confusing. But the general story that we see here with all the other groups is the inequality has actually decreased just slightly, but stayed fairly flat. But remember that part of the reason that's decreased slightly is because, as we saw earlier, black women are working. And so when we look at just who's working, not only black women, but Latinx women and Latinx men and black men, they're working more, they're getting jobs, but those jobs aren't paying them. And so, is that inequality really decreasing? Well, it depends on how you think about it. So finally, looking at education, we see a similar story that we see with health, which I didn't show you, and income, that yes, everyone is getting more bachelor's degrees in 2017 than they were in 1980, but that inequality, between blacks and whites, I thought I put the number there, but I didn't, but it is also about tripled. So on these kind of key measures, inequality is increasing, which beckons the question about progress that becomes really important. Not only do we have these other narratives about individual sin and everything else, the other narrative that Americans love to cherish is a narrative of progress. If you read most, which is what the suggested reading is about, if you read most high school history texts, they are centered around this story that America is great and only ever getting better. And when it comes to racial inequality, that is the story we share. Often, when someone talks about stark inequality, the first thing is, well, it's not as bad as slavery, it's not as bad as Jim Crow, it's not as bad, it's not as bad, it's not as bad. What that does is the same thing that happens when you ask your teenager to go do a chore, say take out the trash, and you come back 5 minutes later and they're not doing anything, and you're like, why aren't you taking out the trash? And you can feel indignant in your anger that they are not doing what you asked them to do. But if you come back 5 minutes and you're not really paying attention and you're like, why isn't the trash out? And they're like, I'm working on it, and they're genuinely working on it, you can't say much. They're trying. That's the same thing that's happening in our nation. People are saying racial inequality is a problem. It's a bigger problem than it was. We need to deal with this. And our nation's response is, we're working on it. It's getting better. Chillax. It's been our nation's response since the beginning of our nation state. You track what was happening during emancipation. You track what was happening during Jim Crow laws. It's the same story over and over. Stop. Don't complain too much. We're making progress. We're trying. It's okay. But when you stop and think about it, if we're not making progress, that narrative is only perpetuating the racial structure. So why is this racial structure perpetuating? Well, I'm going to argue, as most sociologists would, that segregation is a key piece of this. And when we think about segregation, that word generally gets associated with the civil rights movement and the segregation of Jim Crow South. But the truth is, and why it's so important, why it's so important is because it perpetuates divergent wealth accumulation. It influences public schools. It influences public transportation, stores, what's available where, employment, which gets to the networks that we were mentioning, right? Who actually knows who to get into different jobs. And so when we look at racial segregation, there's a whole bunch of different ways to measure racial segregation, and that's like actually one of my favorite things to do, and I've written like 5 papers on it. So if you want to have a long discussion about it, like please ask, because I would love to. But without that discussion, I'm going to tell you that white segregation drives these inequalities more than any other measure. And so when we look at white segregation, this is white segregation, what we see is it's increasing and it's continuing to increase. Notice that the last are 2010, 2015, so it looks like it's a little flatter, but that's just partially because I don't have 2020. So it's not actually flatter, it's just an optical illusion given the time that we're almost 2020 data. Not really, we still have a few years till it's real data. But the fact is that this is residential. School segregation has also gone up dramatically since 1980. Every form, occupational segregation has gone up. What we know is problematic about segregation, what we fought for in the 60s and 70s, is only increasing since the 80s. So why is that happening? Well, one of the main reasons that's happening is because of how we do housing and appraisals. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to share some of my own, well, this is all my research, but this is some more research that is actually currently under review. And I'm going to have fun and get a little technical with you. If you thought I got technical before, I'm sorry, we're going to get a little more technical. But I'm also going to go kind of fast. So this is just my pre-warning. Put on your helmet, your seatbelt. Here we go. All right, so 1989, or 29, I can't talk. Stock market crash. Goes down, country freaks out. FDR gets elected. FDR's vision is to bolster, thank you, thank you so much, Linda, is to bolster the middle class. And part of that central vision is we're going to do that through home ownership. So 1934 Housing Reform Act, he institutes the Federal Housing Administration. Federal Housing Administration, their goal was to enable middle class stabilization through home ownership. At the time, average mortgages were 3 to 5 years, and you had to have a substantial down payment. That changed with this one act. They made mortgages on average 30 years with as small as 5% down payments depending on the situation. This radically changed who could get homes. It radically changed how we thought about home ownership. And it centralized, instead of owning land once you were already rich, it centralized home ownership as the key way of accumulating wealth. That did not exist arguably anywhere before this happened in 1934. But as part of it, how they had to convince the banks to do this, they're moving the banks from 3 to 5 years of mortgages to 30 years of mortgages. That's a big change. So they convinced the banks to do that by saying, we will insure the mortgages. But in order to insure the mortgages, we want to make sure you're not selling them for crazy prices. So to make sure you're not selling them for crazy prices, we're going to institutionalize appraisals, which also didn't exist before this time. And in order to institutionalize appraisals, the process of evaluating how much prices our houses should be worth, we're going to have to come up with a system to figure out how much your house should be worth. And we're going to base that off of neighborhoods and use the newly created Home Owners Loan Corporation, or HOLC's, maps that are based on racial composition. Here's Pittsburgh's on the map. So it wasn't just, this is now colloquially called redlining. Many of you have probably heard of that. And we usually think about it with mortgages and the recent housing crash. It wasn't just about that, though. It was about evaluating homes. It was the price of homes. This was the main way that we evaluated homes until a combination of 4 acts leading up to the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act. At which point, the practice of deliberately using these maps was outlawed. However, at that moment, a new practice called comps took into effect. Research has mainly looked at how this historical practice has made dramatic impacts on wealth accumulation. So if you were in houses that were allowed to accumulate wealth and you could buy them, then you made lots of money. And then because of that money, those houses could be tax-mire, which means those schools got more funding from the taxes, which means they had more resources, which means also the public transit had more resources, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things we talk about with segregation were really fundamentally changed and created because of this policy. But since 1980, so Outlawed in 1977. It didn't really fully get outlawed until about 1980, so 1980 becomes our starting point. This is not, this isn't a model, this is just pure descriptive data, not adjusted really for anything, just these are the numbers. This is how much houses and white neighborhoods versus communities of color have been, or what they're considered worth in these years. The inequality from 1980 to 2015 has doubled. So how has this happened? Well, there's lots of reasons, there's lots of theories. One, that when you talk about this, the first thing you'll be like, well, housing quality is different. So there's a historical segregation, and that meant that like the houses and the communities of color were smaller and they were lower quality, and so now we can't like evaluate houses of the same quality, and like, that's important, housing quality, cool. Okay, so then the second reason is like socioeconomic inequality, right? So neighborhoods are unequal because of the historical segregation, so it's just the current inequality is just a remnant of the historical inequality. The next one, that's my favorite, is because of real estate demand. Because white people want to live with other white people and they're willing to pay for it. The third one, the fourth reason, which is really, this doesn't really exist in the literature except things that I've published, so just like FYI, but is calling out the current appraisal practices. And the current appraisal practices, if you've ever bought a house, you might be somewhat familiar, is they look at your house and then they try to bring in three comps or three comparable houses in the same neighborhood to decide how much your house is worth. Sometimes, of course, those houses aren't going to look exactly the same, so they're going to have to make adjustments therein. Sometimes they do pull similar houses from other neighborhoods. However, that happens very, very rarely because the entire system is still built on the neighborhood model set up in 1934. So you end up having these very different compositions in different places. So this model, the comps, was what started, or it didn't really start, it was like just a continuation, which means that forget what they're doing now, even just the historical part. We decided how much houses were worth in 1934 based on their racial composition. By 1977, we're like, we're not going to do that explicitly, but we're going to base all house sales on previous sales. Just right there, with no other clauses, meant that we were going to continue the inequality that we had in 1977. But it's not just there. So this is a paper that I have published with a co-author, and this first paper looks at Houston. And what we did is, because we had a whole census, we had like 1 million things, and like I'm a lovely stat person, and I put like 10 different data sets in, and I know you probably can't fully read it, but basically everything you ever wanted to know about the house, the physical condition, if it had fireplaces, if it had pools, like everything appraisal would know is in the model. As well as school quality, as well as how many feet, literally, GIS this, how many feet would it take you to walk from your front door to the nearest park? That's in the model. Like everything, including real estate demand. How many people are looking at houses in this area? What are they buying for, et cetera, et cetera. And after everything's in the model, everything is controlled for, and that's the bar graph you get. There's over a $200,000 difference between Black and Latinx neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, holding everything constant. Same house, same everything. So then we wanted to take this and look at this nationally. So, this is to conceptualize it. So that was the quant part. This same paper has interviews with appraisers. And so one appraiser was talking about the near north side, which is a middle-class Latinx neighborhood north of downtown Houston. The houses look like this. They referred to this area as the ghetto and said if they couldn't find a comp in this area, they would pull from a neighborhood that was 40 miles away that was a low-income Latinx neighborhood because that's what was comparable. When asked, how about the Heights, which is right across the highway and was built at the same time, looks very similar, but is predominantly white, they said, no, that comp would be University Place, which is by Rice University, and the richest neighborhood in the city. That's where we would pull that comp from. So they're articulating these practices as well. So to look at this, we then look at across the entire nation. So we take this, noting that Black and Latinx neighborhoods are the same, and we kind of create a way of looking at Black Latinx in a proportion ratio that I'm happy to return to if you're actually curious. But what we do is we say, okay, we're going to run 3 different models to test all those hypotheses that I threw out there. And we're going to run them for every single metropolitan area in the country separately because we know that the housing markets are different. And that really quick thing that I went too fast is obviously these prices are very different in these different communities, and thus we're taking that into consideration. So we run 107 models for 5 different time periods, 3 different models to test all the hypotheses. So we have 1,605 models. Of course, I'm going to show you all of that, and that makes tons of sense to everyone. Of course not. But the short version is, when we hold constant housing quality, we see that the inequality over time is actually even larger than just the descriptives. So housing quality is not at all a part of the story. Secondly, we take socioeconomic inequality. Yes, that is part of it. But we see that when you took housing quality and socioeconomic inequality into consideration, 1980, the difference between the appraisers was not that much. The difference comes in between 2000 and 2015. So if we take, this is the descriptive model that I showed you before, if we hold everything constant, we see that the inequality is much larger. In fact, a house in 1980 in a white neighborhood by 2015 appreciated in 2015 dollars approximately $266,000, holding everything constant, right? We're holding the same houses. Anyone want to guess? What do we got for our Black and Latinx neighbor? 7,000. So we're seeing an increase of wealth just because of this, not to mention all of its other implications. So we then go on, so it's not those two things, we go on to look at real estate demand, and we do this fun thing where we look at different metropolitan areas that have different racial compositions and compare how those real estate demands are affecting it. And basically, what we're able to show is that real estate demand is actually doing the inverse as what we would expect. So the inequality is larger where there is actually even less demand for white neighborhoods. So finally, we look at this last piece, this contemporary practice. And this is like really fun modeling stuff, but I know way too nerdy, but I love it. And why it's really fun is because I say, okay, we know that the historical part is a part of the problem. So let's hold constant what this house used to be worth, and then see how the racial demographics that are changing are affecting how much it's worth now. And what you see in this model is when we hold that constant, so basically, we take a house in the same neighborhood that's the same house, and then we do a model such that we can say, how did this neighborhood become more Black and Hispanic versus how about if it became more white? So it has the same historical effect, it's the same house, it's the same neighborhood. And as you see, the inequality expands. So that means it's not just the historical part, it's also the contemporary part. And so when we think about this, and when I normally talk about this, I focus on how we're selling these things by color, and that there are lots of systematic policy ways that we can think about institutionalizing and reconstructing audits to actually deal with this, not to mention having to wrestle with the historical remedies. But in the next very short amount of time, I want to take this a slightly different direction because of the crowd and ask us about stewardship. So we use this concept all the time in the church. We know that people use it in ways that bother us. We know that it's used and misused in all sorts of ways. We know that people take verses and change them, but often, no matter how they're using them, even when we use it, we have a sense that stewardship is a wise use of resources, that we are being wise with what we have. And often we use verses like this from Proverbs and others that basically say, you know, if you save wealth and give it to your children, or if you are wise with your resources, you're going to be able to give to the poor. And so we justify our own increase in wealth because of our own ability to give to others. Yet the more I've wrestled with this myself, the more I've realized how closely it parallels the use of Scripture to justify slavery. So when we use Scripture to justify slavery, we conceptualize that we are actually doing the Black population a good thing, just like we conceptualize we're doing the poor a good thing by giving money of our wealth. That we are helping them by taking them out of their unchristian, savage ways and bringing them to our country and civilizing them. And then we use Scripture to justify our relationship with them in various ways as our wealth was expanding. And so I want us to think, when we think about America, when we think about who we are here, I want us to push on two things. One, and it was brought up earlier, but especially for the white Americans in the room, we are strangers in this land. This land does not belong to us. Not utterly doesn't belong to anyone, but it definitely does not belong to us. Our houses do not belong to us. Our churches do not belong to us. So not only in our own ways of thinking about how we're accumulating wealth via our houses and other mechanisms, but also where we're putting our churches and how we're thinking about that. I know the Free Methodist Church has a beautiful history of caring about a lot of these injustices. But if we think about the scope of the Free Methodist Church history, it has followed much of the white church, which meant that as the white population left the cities because they were federally enabled to by those policies from the 1930s, so did our churches. And now there is a risen interest in going back into the city right when the de-investment is such that a reinvestment by the white population is becoming advantageously, economically advantageous for the white population and thus the church. And now we are less interested in the inner ring suburbs where our Black and Latinx and in some cases Native American populations are living. So on both levels, I think we need to think individually and as a church that stewardship is not just taking care of what is ours, but recognizing we are called to take care of what is God's, and that requires us to think about land in a way that incorporates things like the Jubilee, as well as the people who we are living with and on that land in a way that calls us to once again give back up of what never was ours and think about how we can actually use that for God's will.